All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest specialist with Purdue University in their Department of Entomology. Today, we are hosting Jennifer Jeswick of the Northern Research Station with the USDA Forest Service, and she is going to be talking to us today about oak wilt, a very, very nasty disease within oak trees in the US right now. Jennifer, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Bob. Thanks also for the opportunity to present today to this group. Oak wilt has been a topic of interest to me, believe it or not, since 1974, and it continues to be. I was introduced to it as an undergraduate at college. And secondly, I wanted to say I realize the diversity of the audience that has joined today, and so it can be quite broad. So I hope each of you learned something that's appropriate to your area of work and your background knowledge on oak wilt. So oak wilt is a significant and often usually fatal disease of oaks that occurs. And so far up till last year in the United States. It occurs from western Texas to northward to Nebraska and then eastward to the Atlantic coast. It causes death of oak trees in settings ranging from urban, as you see on the left, to wooded home sites on the bottom right, and then also in extensive forest areas. It was first recognized in the early first described, I should say, as a disease in the 1942, but it continues to be a problem to this day, and in some areas causes epidemics. Although oak wilt is found in 24 of the U.S. states in the eastern part of the country in general. Today, I've chosen just to focus on the disease in the Midwest and the Northeast. So you see this distribution map, the most recent one we have available for the states in the 20 states in the Midwest and Northeast, as well as parts of Ontario, Canada are marked here. So the disease is still expanding its range. There are two notable things I want to talk about. One is you see the gold stars in north of the United States and Canada, and these are recent finds this past year in southern Ontario, Canada, and they are diseased trees, not just the fungus being picked up off of logs or something. So very notable. First time that oak wilt has been detected outside of the United States. And the other thing I wanted to mention is since 2008, oak wilt has been detected in New York State in both the lower part in Long Island and in the upstate New York. And you see two places there. So it is still moving, still of concern for other parts of the United States, including the Western US, that it could get established there if it were introduced. And then secondly, I want to note that the pathogen in the past 10 or so years, 15 years, has been noted to be causing mortality in chestnut orchards in Michigan and Ohio. So it still is an important disease, continuing to be of concern. So today I would like to make my I have organized my presentation around three things. First, just a refresher course for most of you on the oak wilt basics, and I highlight the points that are most pertinent to what I want to say about management of oak wilt. And then I'll end with some examples of recent results from research and development efforts and a couple ongoing projects. So much more information actually is available on both what I'll talk about in terms of oak wilt basics and oak wilt management, and an interactive story map, ArcGIS story map that's available online. And I believe the link has already been provided to you already by Bob Bruner. So if I'm just skimming the surface here, so please feel free to check out that story map for more details. So for this current section that covers oak wilt basics, I'll highlight causal aspects about the causal fungus, aspects of the hosts that are affected by this fungus, and then important parts of the spread of the pathogen. So let's get started with the oak wilt pathogen. It's a fungus and belongs to the Ascomycete class. The name of the fungus was changed around 2018, a taxonomic change from formerly, you've probably heard of it as Ceratocystis fagacearum. We now call it Bretziella fagacearum. It's fairly easy to isolate and grow the fungus in the laboratory. So you see these pictures on the left of it growing in the lab. The characteristic fruity smell, kind of like a juicy fruit gum smell or fruit salad smell, is produced by the fungus. And this smell can be detected in both lab cultures and in nature on the sporulating mats. There are two different spore types of this pathogen. They're asexual spores called Canidia, and I'll be mentioning these later, as well as sexual spores called ascospores. And in nature, we find the fungus sporulating on recently killed oak trees that have died from oak wilt, and they produce this really unique structure called, some people call them oak wilt mats or sporulating mats. And this structure is formed on the outer bark and on the inner bark, and the outer xylem in a mirror image fashion that you see here. And it involves a felt-like kind of oval mat, and it's on that mat that the fungus sporulates, producing these two types of spores I've already told you about. And there will be dense, sterile fungal tissue that we call pressure pads. And these opposing pressure pads on a tree, as they grow, they're what cause the bark to split, and usually in a vertical manner. And this vertical crack in the bark allows insects to come in, and I'll be talking about insect vectors of oak wilt shortly. Well, there are over 33 species of quercus or oaks that are susceptible to oak wilt, and there are a few other species and related genera within the family of Fagaceae. These include chestnut, I've already told you about. We've known that oak wilt occurs in Chinese chestnut, for example, since the 1960s. And tan oak is also susceptible. And for those of you who know the West Coast, tan oak is an important species on the West Coast. So we don't want oak wilt to get there. The oaks are divided taxonomically into sections, and two of those major sections are the red oaks and the white oaks, and we have species of both of those in our two regions that I'm talking about today. In general, the red oaks are highly susceptible to the fungus in terms of, let me kind of qualify what I mean by that. Once a red oak tree becomes infected by the fungus, the fungus spreads within the tree very rapidly, and trees will die quickly. And sometimes that can be 4 weeks from first onset of symptoms, or it can be multiple months. Maybe even the tree will flush out in the spring of the next year and then die. But generally, that's what I mean by high susceptibility. The white oak group exhibit different range of susceptibility, and I call that moderate to low. Depends on the white oak species. I work in the Midwest, and we have a lot of bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, and white oak, Quercus alba. So, for example, the bur oaks are moderate in susceptibility, and as the fungus, if the fungus comes into that tree, it can move about, but it's the tree actually has defenses to kind of stop it in different places. So we get a kind of a scattered pattern in the crown of development, and so this kind of host response doesn't prevent death of the tree, but it slows it down, so it occurs over several years instead of as quickly as red oaks. Quercus alba is even lower in susceptibility to disease development, and we often see kind of like a dieback pattern where a main fork or several branches on one part of the tree will show symptoms, but the rest of the crown will look pretty healthy. And I've seen white oaks survive infection by the oak wilt fungus for 20 years, but I've also seen other white oaks succumb within 5 to 6 years. So range of susceptibility there. Okay, I've already alluded to this, but once the fungus is introduced to the xylem, it has to come into the sapwood or xylem of the tree to infect. Once it gets into the vascular system, and there are structures called vessels. And once it is introduced, the conidia or asexual spores of the fungus can spread very quickly throughout a red oak tree via the xylem sap flow. In the white oaks, it doesn't spread as quickly. I won't go into the reasons, but it does still spread. But because of this systemic vascular systemic distribution, it's called a systemic wilt disease. All right, then how does it spread from disease to healthy trees? Well, in general, we have two ways we like to categorize, two categories we like to talk about as pathologists. It spreads above ground or overland by insects, and below ground or through root grafts in our two regions from a disease to a healthy tree. And I'll talk about each of those separately. So first, the above ground transmission is really by insects. We have some aggravating factors like humans who help the insects spread it. But anyway, pathogen transmission is overland is by insects. The best documented vectors, insect vectors, are the nididulid beetles, or we call them sap feeding beetles. Some people call them sap beetles, and the oak bark beetles. So you see the diagram on the right. There are different kind of routes that occur for these beetles to transmit the fungus to a healthy tree. So oak bark beetles just generally colonized stress oak trees, and it can be white or red oaks. And doing so, as they score the bark like a typical bark beetle, they can acquire, if a tree is infected, they can acquire spores of the fungus, particularly probably the conidia, but we could get the other type too. And then they go to a healthy tree, and during their maturation feeding on a healthy tree, they make their own wound, and the fungus can be transmitted. Nididulid beetles are different in that they require a wound on a tree to get the fungus to the xylem. So nididulid beetles are, I think, pretty closely associated, highly evolved with the oak wilt fungus in a way. They are attracted to the oak wilt spore mats I've talked about. The fruit, well, there's an odor, different odors produced by the fungus metabolites that attract sap beetles, a large number of species, and they will feed on those mats. So actually lay eggs and rear their broods in those mats. And when they emerge, as you can imagine, nididulid beetles can carry fungus spores on their bodies. But transmission is only going to occur if those contaminated beetles go to a fresh wound on a healthy oak. And we know in the upper Midwest here, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, especially, that there are two species of nididulid beetles that seem to be the primary vectors, accounting for over 90% of the transmission. But this varies in other parts of the two regions, though it's not. There can be other nididulid species. And some people are still concerned that oak bark beetles might be important, particularly in states further east, but more research is needed. All right, so the nididulid beetles, as I said, require a fresh wound to transmit the fungus. So I think for this talk, I just want to really emphasize that we're concerned about the season of the year during which this transmission by Nitidula beetles occurs, and that is generally in the spring and early summer. And why do I say that? Well, at least for the Midwest, we know that it's during late winter through mid-July that we see a peak in oak wilt mat production, particularly on the red oak species that have died the previous year. We see a peak population periods of the at least the two principal sap beetle vectors I've talked about. And then the fresh wounds on it can be red oaks or bur oaks or white oaks are especially attractive to these to the two principal sap beetle vectors that we've identified, at least for the Midwest. And also their large diameter vessels of springwood produced by the red oaks that particularly favor that internal spread of the canidia of the fungus throughout the tree, while that early wood or springwood is active and before the summer wood is laid down. Okay, I've already alluded to this, but humans can also mediate this insect transmission when they move oak logs or firewood with oak wilt mats, or ones that produce oak wilt mats eventually. And this can result in Nitidula beetles coming from those mats and going to the new site where the logs or firewood has been transported. So we've documented this in a number of cases for new establishment of oak wilt centers, some distance from the known areas that have been affected. All right, now I'm really running through this quickly because I can talk for hours about these topics. So hope I'm not losing anyone. I want to move on then to pathogen transmission through grafted roots. So this below ground spread involves the oak wilt fungus spores moving passively in the transpiration stream from a diseased tree to a healthy one through connected root systems. And in our two regions, this is through functional root grafts. It's a whole different story in Texas. They have root grafts, but they also have another system operating. But for us, it's these functional root grafts. What is a functional root graft? Well, it's when you have two roots that actually sometimes you'll see two roots come together and it looks like they're fused, but they're not. But it's when they actually, the tissues fuse together and we get the vascular systems connected between two of these roots from two different trees. So root graft, actually, root grafting is very common in tree species, both conifers as well as hardwoods. So a successive root graft spread in oaks with the oak wilt fungus occurs over time, and as more and more trees get infected through this below ground spread, we get a pattern of an expanding disease center on a site, especially in a wooded area. You can see this. So this root grafting is very important. It's important to know a little bit about it. So this is just a summary slide I've developed from my work over the years of root grafting can occur within a tree, self-grafting, and I think that might allow the fungus to actually move around the root system of a single tree to get to another side and then pass the fungus on to an adjacent tree that's grafted. So we found that self-grafts are common in northern pin oak. And then there are the grafts that occur between two trees of the same species, like northern pin oak or northern red oak or bur oak. And these are just some statistics from the old literature. So for northern pin oak in the central sands of Wisconsin, over 70% of northern pin oaks were found to be grafted to one or more trees, neighboring trees. So it can be quite common on certain sites. And the statistics for the bur oak are much less, as you see. And then there's the grafting between different species and even different species of a different red oak section, or a different oak section or oak group. So a white to a red species that's in the white oak group versus that in a red oak. So you can see the statistics there. The bottom line is grafting does occur between, say, northern red oak and white oak. The other thing I want to just highlight about root grafting is the frequency of root grafting, and then, of course, then the availability for the oak wilt fungus to spread that way is affected by a number of things besides just the species. It can depend on whether there are non-oak species present on the site or in a forest stand. If you see a change in tree species composition on a forest site from oak to, say, aspen and other things, that will of course impede or prevent then, well, you won't see any grafting, obviously. So that has to be taken into account. Oak stand density is important. So the distance over which roots will graft varies. And but of course, the more dense the stand, if it's a northern pin oak stand on a standy site in the Midwest, there's great high frequency there for grafting, for example. Terrain matters, whether it's flat terrain or a hilly terrain with steep slopes. You'll see greater grafting on the flat or rolling lands. And soils, light textured soils like sand soils, loamy sand, sandy loams have the highest frequency of grafting. And then, of course, as you get to the heavier textured soils, it's less frequent. All right, so I ran through the basics. I hope I didn't lose anybody. Now we'll move on to oak wilt management. And again, I'm just talking about the Midwestern and Northeastern states. My simple approach for today's presentation is to first talk about controlling spread, be it above ground or below ground, and then I will talk about how such strategies and tools are woven together in an integrated approach. But let me step back, and I'm not a university professor, but I'll put on a professorial hat for a minute. Let's just talk about conceptual approach to disease management in general, and especially in forest pathology. These are the steps, just so you know, that I consider to be involved in disease management. Some people may think disease management is just applying some type of control tool, but I believe it begins with detection of a disease on a site, be it urban or in a rural forest. Then once a putative disease is putatively present, considered to be present, a diagnosis of what's causing that tree to have the symptoms that are exhibited or to have died. This, of course, and probably involves bringing in a forest pathologist if you're not familiar with that disease. And then the assessment phase can be quite involved, assessment or appraisal. It would be things like delimiting the area affected by this particular disease. How extensive is it? What's the potential for it to blow up and become like an epidemic in the area? What is there a threshold for when you need to take action? Are there other species present on the site that might limit its spread, things like that. And then if it's action, some type of management action is desired, it's always good, but not always done, but to have some well-defined goals and objectives of individual actions, or if it's a program of a coordinated program, what are the goals in disease management? And then consider the different disease strategies known to work for that particular disease and the available tools. Once there's a lot of things that go in with that, of course. How effective are they? How practical are they to use? How costly are they? Can you get into a stand with it? Things like that. So once those tools are chosen and strategies, then the treatment is implemented. But it's very important not just to walk away. After treatments, sites need to be monitored and further, not like every day, but maybe once a year. But monitoring is very important, and it's not just over a year or two. It can be It can be multiple years, or it can be decades for some pathology problems. I'm thinking of dwarf mistletoe in that case. So that's the concept. Now I'm going to step back into my role as a oak wilt pathologist. And let's get back to the oak wilt disease cycle. And so this slide depicts areas where we can break the oak wilt disease cycle and thus hopefully manage the problem. You've heard of the Achilles heel, weak points, where something can be is most susceptible to being stopped or managed, and so that's what we have here. So you'll see there are 6 sites where it's possible to break the cycle. So we have 2 phases, of course, the above ground phase. These are places where we can either stop insect transmission, or we can work within a tree to maybe prevent full colonization of the tree. And then that below ground phase where we can stop spread from disease to healthy trees. So using these disruption points, there are 4 general, for today's presentation anyway, 4 general strategies I'm outlining here of what can be done, or what approach can be taken to break the disease cycle at these indicated points. And so the rest of this section of my presentation will be organized around this. So preventing the transfer of the fungus, preventing formation of those spore mats, particularly when nididulid beetles are involved, preventing or suppressing the spread within the tree, and then preventing or suppressing the passage from spreading through those root grafts. So let's start with preventing the transfer of the pathogen to healthy trees by insects. So most of these points that I've made here of actions we can take involve nididulid beetle transmission. The oak bark beetles and research I've done in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, we think oak bark beetles are of minor importance in transmitting the fungus. So just keep that in mind if you're from a different area, that these are primarily for nididulid beetle transmission. So in these cases, don't prune or harvest trees in the high hazard time periods, and that is in the late winter to midsummer in general. Depends on how far south or north you are. That time period shifts. If wounds do occur on a tree, like through spring storms, or it's necessary to prune for whatever reason during that high hazard time period, you can treat immediately with treat that wound surface, and ideally with a water soluble paint, but any type of paint that will cover that surface and prevent the beetles from coming in contact with the wood. And some DNRs for some states, or even some communities or counties, have developed best management practices. So if they're available to you, consult them, and within that you'll find guidelines for how to prevent transfer of the pathogen, i.e. introduction of oak wilt into new areas. And one example is shown on the right here. These are oak harvesting guidelines to reduce the risk of introduction and spread of oak wilt. This is a document that was produced in conjunction with the Wisconsin Council on Forestry and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and it's available by way online. And then I've already mentioned this: don't move logs or firewood from areas with oak wilt to oak wilt free areas. And we know this with other insect and disease problems, that it's a kind of a mantra we have now. There are other things that can be done, but these are just some key points. But I also want to mention that it's important to prevent the formation of the oak wilt spore mats if possible, again, because that prevents the nididulid beetles from acquiring the fungus. So on the left side, you'll see the steps involved in identifying, dealing with, and then properly disposing of logs or firewood from such settings. So what happens in an organized program, there are surveys done in usually in late fall and through the winter, of what trees, and they're usually the red oaks, are likely to produce spore mats. And we call those PSPTs, potential spore producing trees. And so those are marked, and in the winter, whoever, the landowner, the city, whoever's responsible, will fell those trees and cut them into shorter lengths, or even split them into firewood. They best to stack them if you want to use them for firewood, for example. Stack it, cover it with a tarp or some type of plastic, seal it at the ground line, and keep that tarp on through the fall, say September, October of the subsequent growing season. And then the oak wilt fungus is quickly, or not quickly, but over the course of a year, is replaced by other fungi in cut logs or firewood. And so after that period under a tarp, almost a year in length, not quite, but the tarp can be removed and the wood can be utilized. Okay, so that's one way. Another way that's not well known, but is documented through the years, through the decades, is to girdle the main stem of trees that are exhibiting early crown symptoms during if it's picked up during a detection survey in the summer. And you see, not quite obvious, but the forester who works with me is shown here with a chainsaw doing 2 encircling cuts on a tree that had a 50% crown wilt rating. And if you do this early, it leads to the tree sapwood drying down quickly, and we would not see oak wilt spore mats forming on that tree in the next spring during the high hazard period. And that's because the mats, it's been shown back in the 1950s that mats form when the wood of the sapwood of the red oak are between 37 and 45% moisture content. All right, moving to another strategy of preventing or suppressing spread within a tree. 2 things I want to mention. The first one is what you see here. And this is a new technique in a way that was developed in the last 10 or so years by foresters in the Menominee tribal area of central Wisconsin. Menominee Tribal Enterprises manages the forests on those tribal lands. And they said, well, if we get a new infection center starting, if we detect a single tree among other clearly healthy trees, and there's evidence of overland spread, like in the case shown here in the left photo, there was a broken branch, and they saw about 40% of the crown wilting. They said, what if can we stop the fungus from moving throughout the tree? The fungus does move in the diurnal sap flow, and that's how it gets spread throughout a tree when it comes in overland. But can we catch it before it gets down into the root system? And so then they girdled and applied herbicide, and then they've been following their success rate, and it's been actually quite successful if they catch a tree in early wilt stages. So we call that the rapid response method. So that's pretty exciting. And then another thing I want to mention under prevent or suppress spread within a tree, but don't have a picture here, is the use of systemic fungicide injections. And again, this is a more costly approach to use systemic fungicide injections, but it's justified, especially in urban settings with a high value tree. If you do this, indeed, you can arrest the further development of oak wilt in a tree that's just starting to show early symptoms, particularly effective in the white oak species, not so much in the red. But I want to emphasize that the fungicides that are used do not kill the oak wilt fungus in a tree. When it's used in this manner, it won't eradicate the fungus, and retreatment would be necessary. All right, the third area is to prevent or suppress the pathogen from spreading through connected roots. I'm going to take a drink of water here. Okay, a lot of work has been done on this and a lot of different options are available. So I've divided this into 3 different approaches. It can be disruption of roots can be done in some manner. The vibratory plow has a 60 inch blade and that can effectively cut roots down hopefully to 60 inches, 5 feet, and minimally disruptive to a site. That's one way. It's commonly used, for example, in Minnesota and I believe in Michigan. Another method on especially terrain that has a lot of boulders and glacial terrain where it's really not possible to pull a vibratory plow blade through. A backhoe has been used to cut around. First the trees are felled and then backhoe cuts the roots around the cut stumps, and so you're basically cutting the root systems. Other methods are using a mini excavator, using a trencher. You can use a hand shovel if you want to work that hard to get down to 5 feet. In Texas, they use a rock saw. But anyway, lots of ways of doing that cutting. Another method is to create a dead zone of trees between the wilted and oak wilt killed trees and neighboring healthy trees, but of course you need some healthy trees in between because you don't know if the fungus is in the root system of the neighboring trees or not. But anyway, using a girdle herbicide method, a zone of dead trees and hopefully dead roots. We know though that the roots aren't all killed with the herbicide with this treatment, but anyway, create that dead zone and hopefully the fungus is not going to move beyond that over time. And the third approach is to use systemic fungicides. Again, I've already mentioned systemic fungicides may be used to hold the pathogen at bay, so to speak, in the roots of the diseased trees, so the fungus won't cross into the roots of that healthy tree that has a root graft. And the problem there is the fungicide degrades over time, even below ground. It'll last 24 to 36 months, we found out, but then retreatment would be needed if it's in a high hazard zone, or a high disease pressure, I should say, not high hazard zone, high disease pressure. And I would be remiss if I didn't touch on just the importance of how you determine the edge of the treatment zone or where the root cutting is done, say by the vibratory plow. This is very, very important for the success of managing below ground spread. A number of models have been used through the years. The first model that I'm aware of that was developed was published in 1978. We affectionately call it the French model after Dave French, and a very simple model. You have 2 tiers of trees. You have the dead trees in the center, this model on the left, and then you have a ring of healthy appearing trees. And then the second tier of trees, you put your outermost, the outermost control line would be placed between that first and second tier of trees. And if you wanted a secondary line could be placed between the most recently wilted trees and the first tier, but I can tell you that's only about 50% effective with the vibratory plow. Anyway, statistical models were developed in the late 80s and published in the early 90s by Johann Bruin and a colleague, Professor Pickens in Michigan University. And these are very useful for people who are doing oak wilt treatment but don't really have much experience working with the disease. And so they just take measurements of diameters of trees, diameter of the source of the oak wilt fungicide is a wilting or wilted tree. And then the trees, healthy trees beyond, get their 2 diameters. They add them up. They look on a table that accompanies publications that you'll find with this model explained. And then they see the minimum distance they need to place that outer perimeter line or treatment zone edge So that's commonly used in a number of states. There are 3 different soil types that have different models, so you can pick the one that's most appropriate for your situation if you wish to use that model, one of those models. And then a number of foresters I've met through the decades of working with oak wilt have developed their own kind of rules of thumb models. And this on the right is an example of a oak wilt forester in Minnesota who's worked with oak wilt management for over 40 years. And he uses a 60-foot distance between a diseased tree and healthy trees. And in general, that's where he lays his plow lines. But he does take into account when there are clumps of trees, and he does, in general, consider diameter. And I've talked to other foresters who have different models. So anyway, this is very important though, because if you lay an outer perimeter and you're doing a zone-based treatment like girdle herbicide, how far out you kill that tree, obviously you're going to be killing a lot of healthy looking trees in between the disease center and the edge where you put that. So these are very, very important to consider. Okay. The last area of management that I want to touch on then is integration of these strategies and tools and tactics. So I think you know what that means, but what do I mean by it? So it involves coordinated use of multiple strategies and tactics. And but these are not done in a one-size-fits-all fashion, but rather prescriptive actions are developed and used for specific site or landscape conditions, and they're aligned with the management objectives that hopefully have been preset. I could talk at great length about examples for this, but today I'll just give you 3 different settings, ranging from a suburban setting, extensive forest area, to an area where the oak wilt fungus is new, relatively new, and is threatening to move out even further. Examples of these scenarios, at least 2 of them, can be found in the oak wilt story map that's available online if you want greater detail. So my first example is close to home. I'm located in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that's where my lab is, but I've worked across 20 states of the region, 2 regions, by the way. But this is a oak wilt management situation in a wooded residential community. So wooded home sites is what I'm talking about. This information that I'm going to share have been provided by the 2 folks who have served as the oak wilt forester, or actually just a forester for this community over decades, the last 3 decades, 4 decades. So this is an aerial map they gave me of the community. There are homes in little white dots that you may or may not be able to see lining the streets and roads that you see there. But anyway, it's a large area. This integrated management of oak wilt has been ongoing in the city of North Oaks since at least 1972. And I know from my major professor years ago, Dave French, that he started control actions there in 1948. So amazing to have such a program. And I will say the program has been very, very successful in conserving oaks in this community. So this graphic provides an overview of the city of North Oaks oak wilt management program by different components that I've laid out here. You know, it just involves different things. Routine monitoring and detection, of course, is essential, and quick action. So site visits and development of these individual treatment plans, and then applying those treatments. There's winter surveys that are done for those potential spore producing trees and removing those trees, etc. Follow-up evaluations of treatments, and then possibly retreatment as needed. And education is key. And also just so homeowners understand what's going on. But in terms of the presentation I've already given you on tools and tactics, this is how the North Oaks program it's kind of set up, in how these different tools and tactics fall into their overall system. So for the approach I told you about disrupting those connected root systems, depending on the situation, they use different methods to do that root cutting, as you see on the upper left. They also use systemic fungicides because these are high value trees, and they, in particular, in this particular community, they tend to use macro infusion of propiconazole at the root collar, and they retreat every 2 to 3 years after if the disease pressure is high. They're very faithful, diligent, consistent in removing and properly disposing of any wood, logs, main stem sections from wilted trees, and education. They actually publish articles regularly in the local newspaper for the residents. So integration of all these methods has led to a very successful program. All right, I'm switching to the next one, which is oak wilt management and a forested landscape. This is in Michigan. In the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, there's extensive forest, and a lot of those include northern red oak and northern pin oak. And it's a fairly flat terrain with light textured soil, so high probability of root grafting. The Michigan DNR operates a comprehensive program that crosses many land ownerships. So, but basically this shows the process very quickly. They detect, they delimit, they set their barrier treatment out of treatment line, and then they use a vibratory plow to install to do the root cutting. They remove any identified PSPTs, but they monitor for over 4 years. And this has been a very successful program. I think it's over 80-some%. It's in the oak wilt story map again. The other example is oak wilt management at the edge of an expanding disease range, program run by the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. Oak wilt has been detected in 2 general locations in the upstate New York and in the Long Island region, just off of New York City, as you see here. Oak wilt, as I said, was only first picked up in the state in 2008. The goals of the New York DEC program first is to isolate and treat any new finds of oak wilt, and they use a quarantine system to guide their program. They may eradicate if it's possible, and then of course they want to prevent spread. So this is their quarantine system, and you again look at the oak wilt story map to ponder this in detail. But it starts with detection, and in New York they use aerial detection for most of it, helicopter surveys and mapping, and then ground truthing. Exciting development has been the use of detector dogs for detecting the oak wilt fungus in logs or actually in standing trees. And then this quarantine system is really based on whether that's the first detection in an area, in this case in the county, or if it's the second, third, fourth, or on, so on. But they develop these, they have these quarantine districts at the neighborhood level, the town level, and the county level. And then site-specific prescriptive actions are developed within each of those quarantine districts. So lastly, I want to quickly cover oak wilt research and development efforts, not all of them, because there's no way I could, and I don't know of all of them, but some recent examples that you might be interested in. I've already mentioned this several times, the detector dogs, and I think it's pretty cool. How to use them practically and cost effectively is another question, but my colleague at the Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic at Cornell University started working with experts, canine experts, on the use of detector dogs for oak wilt in around 2020. And trained dogs have been used successfully in alerting handlers on diseased trees and logs in upstate New York over the past few years. And YouTube videos available if you want to look those up. You can also check Cornell's site for articles on their program. Also another R&D effort that was completed about 5 years ago. No, this one was completed about around 2020-2021, also conducted in New York State, and that was to use insect trapping for nitidula beetles, followed by identification of those beetles and assay in the laboratory for the oak wilt fungus. This trapping could occur in areas, neighboring or beyond where known oak wilt sites are being treated, just to say, do we have nitidula beetles with the fungus flying around in those woods, and maybe we need to survey those areas more frequently. This has been published. Here's the title. You should have a handout available to you for this webinar with full citations, so you'll know where to look these up if you're interested. So this is just an example of their findings from this early warning system they've developed. This is for Long Island, New York. The red dots are where they picked up and confirmed oak wilt in the past, and the blue arrows indicate where they found positive oak wilt positive beetles in this effort. All right, remote sensing has had a lot of there's a lot of excitement about using remote sensing. I actually started working with remote sensing experts as early as 2005, but it's come a long ways. So there have been two projects that I want to briefly tell you about that show promise. They're not shovel ready for natural resource professionals to use, but they're getting there. The first involves airborne approach with hyperspectral sensors on that platform. So hyperspectral reflectance profiles that were obtained from these overflights by aircraft observations were used to first develop a model that distinguished, and you can see the landscape setting here, distinguished disease from healthy, or first distinguished oak from non-oak, let's put it that way. And then the second step was to distinguish red oaks from white oak species. And then thirdly, distinguish diseased trees from healthy trees. And here the purple represents disease, the green healthy. And these were all, the healthy disease was based on known infrared and shortwave bands of the electromagnetic spectrum that are related to physiological conditions of the tree that are related to wilting of trees. And so the researchers found that the airborne approach differentiated the disease from healthy red oaks with 80% accuracy. And they also demonstrated the potential for pre-visual detection of oak wilt, before you see anything visually in the crown of the tree. So that's very exciting. The second method involves using satellites. Spectral data from Landsat 8 and the Sentinel-2 platforms were used to develop models to map oak wilt occurrence over large landscapes, and I'm talking about a large portion of forested areas of Minnesota and Wisconsin. The novel methodology that these researchers used is called land surface phenology, and that's on the left of this particular graphic. And what happens is this method couples data that captures disease progression, oak wilt crown progression, symptom progression over a growing season from the onset of leaf on to leaf senescence and fall. The measurement that they used was derived from an index of two physiological indicators of leaf conditions, and the researchers found it was possible to distinguish among healthy, as you see on these these diagrams of trees, between healthy, symptomatic, and dead trees with over 80% accuracy. And within the conditions of the study, the models suggested that spatial variations among the measurement indices could identify the different tree crown conditions, healthy versus symptomatic versus dead, with accuracies greater than 89%. So these aren't yet, as I said, shovel ready. A bit further developments needed to make it into a usable tool for resource managers, but we're getting there. And again, full citations for these published papers are available to you in the handout. Diagnosis of oak wilt. We've had research that's really added to this. We have a polymerase chain reaction methods, PCR methods, that have been developed and used and are very effective for quick diagnosis in the laboratory rather than the standard isolation. And currently, there's development underway by some colleagues from the Southeast US using loop-mediated isothermal amplification, or LAMP survey. So keep watching for that being available. Hopefully someday that could be used in the field, not just in the laboratory. And then prediction and prevention. There are recent research published in 2018 about monitoring the flight of the major sap beetle vectors of the oak wilt fungus in Wisconsin through different latitudes of Wisconsin, coupling that with weather, climate data, and coming up with predictions, particularly of when those two beetle species start to fly. So the models are published in a scientific paper, but the neat thing is that the University of Wisconsin Ag Extension people have developed thermal models and have an online risk tool calculator available for folks in Wisconsin to actually consult and say, should we start pruning our oaks? You know, it's the end of March. And so it's neat to see that carry through to a very practical tool. And then tools and tactics for stopping below ground spread. The girdle herbicide treatment that I mentioned to you was recently evaluated, and those results are published in this particular article, again, that you have. And I think I'm just going to mention that this was after 4 years of evaluation. They found that the method was effective in controlling below ground spread with an overall success rate of 55%. These are in forested areas. Greatest success, 81%, was achieved when the infection centers that they were treating were small. They had 4 or fewer infected trees. And then recent publication that's forthcoming is one on evaluation of the operational use of this root rupture and stump extraction method. I'll just, this was done with over 14 years of data collected by the Chequamegon National Forest people, as well as the Menominee Tribal Enterprises in Wisconsin. And one interesting result is that the root rupture method achieved a high level of disease control for 5 years for 85% or greater of the evaluated pockets. But this girdle herbicide method success was lower when there were more, as the number of trees in the original infection center increased. So larger centers were not as successful in being treated. Lastly, I want to mention ecological evaluations that have been post-treatment. As you know, as you've seen, these treatments can be very disruptive on the land site, on a landscape. And this is one particular paper that talks about the diversity, community structure and composition 6 years after treatment compared to the control. One interesting finding is that invasion by invasive plant species actually was very low in all sites. I thought it might be higher in the highly disturbed sites, but it was not. So I want to conclude with these points. Oak wilt continues to be an important and deadly disease of oak species, and now of concern in Ontario, Canada. So there's still concern of its spread to the Western United States, to other countries, as well as further spread in Canada. Early detection, accurate diagnosis, and rapid response really offer the best chance for controlling oak wilt. So a quick response. Oak wilt has been manageable in states where consistent, integrated, and sustained programs have been established and followed. And lastly, as I've shown you, creative and new or improved methods of detection, diagnosis, and treatment are continue to be tested and results made available. So I'll end with that and see what questions we might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for going over that so thoroughly. All right, we do have several questions, and we are a little bit pressed for time, so I'm going to get through them as quick as we can. So our first question was, how are we educating landscaping and tree companies on oak wilt?
Ah, yeah, great question. And we're talking about 20 states here. Individual states, whether it's a Department of Natural Resources, Department of Agriculture, the university extension departments are really take the lead on this, and they do a great job in educating. They can be web-based, there can be podcasts, there can be. So I'll just say, that's a broad brush, but I think it's ongoing. The depth and breadth of that education, though, probably varies from state to state, of course, depending on how much oak wilt is a problem. So I hope that helps.
And one thing I will add is that if you live in the state of Indiana, essentially I'm the one who helps educate on things like that within our area. And you're always free to ask me questions if you live in my state. You have my contact information. So our next question is, are pin oaks susceptible to oak wilt?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that one.
The next question is, are pin oaks susceptible to oak wilt?
Yes, and I am assuming you're talking about Quercus, the pin oak that's widely planted in urban areas, and yes, they're highly susceptible.
And our next question is, could the pathogen move via leaves on the ground?
No.
All right. Do beetle traps for nitidulid beetles exist, and what is a possible approach for them?
Yes, a number of years ago, I did a lot of research on this, and we used a wind-oriented funnel trap that is not available commercially, but we constructed it. There are publications on that and how to use them. So a person could do that on their own. There are then in New York and I think in Michigan, they've used the multi-funnel traps, and those are available commercially, and they bait those with pheromones of two of the nitidulid beetle vectors we know of, and those pheromones are available commercially, and they synergize that with a food bait. So yes, trapping can be done using one of the existing trapping systems. The hard part comes in identifying the nitidulid beetle species trap, because it's difficult. You need experts. And then, of course, you need an expert to isolate the fungus. So sure, you can trap nitidulids, but what does it mean? So it's not for someone, for a layperson to do, is what I'm saying.
And speaking as one of those experts who does identify nitidulid beetles, it is not a job that you would want anyone to ever do. It is not a fun experience. Okay, so our next question here, how many growing degree days would mark the start of the high hazard time period?
Oh, I can't answer that because I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. I use the calculator. So I would suggest you go to the Wisconsin Department of Ag, their thermal models page, and try out the oak wilt calculator using pick a location in Wisconsin and just see how it varies when you play with that system.
So our next question was, what was PSPT? However, our colleague from The Ohio State University, Amy Stone, who also helped put together the Emerald Ash Borer University semester, answered that one, potential spore producing tree.
Correct.
And then we have a question, what other methods of disposing infected trees beside cutting and covering for firewood use are acceptable?
They can be chipped. Let's see. So the firewood, you want to split those sections. Chipping, you could bury, but I don't know if anybody does that. Those are the ones that come to mind. You could burn. And also with logs, commercial size logs, I've seen them utilized in Indiana. So get them to a mill before probably mid to late February, and you can mill those logs and use them.
Okay, so we have, is there any research for treating afflicted trees to prevent their death?
I assume the person asking is referring to an already infected tree. If that's
yes,
the
it
case.
looks like it.
Yeah. So systemic fungicides have been tested for what we call therapeutic treatment, and there are publications available on that. But briefly, most successful in the white oak species. We've tried it with bur oak and with Quercus alba, and we couple that with pruning, and it has been effective in treating red oaks. The problem is catching the disease early enough. If by the time it's 40 or 50% wilted and you apply a systemic fungicide, aesthetically the tree is not pleasing, and so it's really, in my opinion, it doesn't seem worth it. I know city foresters who have used it though, but anyway, that's my opinion.
And then I think the next person down actually linked the oak wilt vectors emergence thermal model that you were just speaking about. So everybody, if you
Great.
could look in the chat for that, you could see that. We have another question here. I think what the person is saying is oak wilt invasion considered to be just a matter of time.
Oak wilt invasion, does that mean
So areas that don't already have it?
Well, how many decades do we go before New York State showed any signs of oak wilt? We probably 30 years. So yes, I mean, we can expect it to spread with humans aiding that, unfortunately. But it's not like an insect pest like emerald ash borer. Oak wilt is more like a below ground, slow burning fire on a site, and the big jumps it makes to start a new expansion of the range, like in New York, who knows? It can be 30 years. So yeah, it could conceivably extend throughout all the range of oak species in North America, but it sure hasn't done it quickly. Let's put it that way. So they're all at risk, but I don't think it's going to be a quick thing unless people start aiding it by carrying firewood with the swarm mats on it all over so it'd have to be intentional to see a very quick uptick.
So we've only got 2 more questions here. How young a tree can be infected? So what's the earliest age a tree can be infected?
I have seen, I'm going to put myself on here. Sorry, I didn't do that sooner. I have seen, little saplings infected, less than an inch in diameter. And I've actually seen mats on those. And that was, I think in that situation, it was through root graft spread from other trees. But so you can have seedlings and saplings naturally regenerated come down with oak wilt in the field.
Okay. And then our last question we have, are there individual trees that potentially develop a resistance and do not succumb?
The general answer is no. Well, we don't know of any resistant trees in general, especially red oaks we're concerned about. We know, of course, the white oak species naturally have some resistance. So, but for the red oaks, I would say no, in general, we don't. I've heard one report of a tree in Wisconsin that continues to recover, but that's the only anecdotal report I've heard for red oak species.
All right. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for taking your time today to talk to us about oak wilt. And we are very, very grateful for it. It was very informative. And I just want to tell everyone else who are still here, if you're interested in getting CEUs for arborists, please contact me through email and I will help you get those. And we will have a recording of this posted within the next day or two. You'll receive an email from me in the next 24 hours with a survey link, as per usual. So thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you, Jennifer, for speaking. And thank you for giving us a great semester with the Emerald Ash Borer University.